Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute entitled Where We've Been and Where We're Going, a conversation on Black History Month. I'm Aaron Woodrick, the director of MLI's Domestic Policy Program. I'm very pleased to be moderating today's conversation featuring what I think is an outstanding panel who I will introduce momentarily. Before I do that, I just want to quickly go over the format for today for our viewers. I'll be introducing the panel, giving them a few minutes to make some introductory remarks. Then they're going to be taking some questions, and then finally we'll wrap up by giving each panelist some time for some final thoughts. I want to remind viewers who are watching on YouTube that they can put questions that they might have for the panel into the chat on the sidebar, and I'll do my best to get to some of those. I do have some questions of my own for the panel, but of course, we love audience participation in these webinars, so please don't be shy in sharing your questions and comments. And with that, I'd like to get underway by introducing the panel. We have four great panelists with us today, starting with Tanya Lee, who's an artistic social entrepreneur and executive producer. Samuel Say, who's a writer, blogger, and owner of slowtowrite.com. Jamil Jivani, who's senior fellow for diversity and empowerment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And finally, Garth Rowe, who's a professor of evangelism and community outreach at Canada Christian College. I want to thank all of the panelists very much for joining me today.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll start, maybe Tanya, if you'd like to take it away with some introductory remarks.
So my name is Tanya Marie Lee, and I run a book club for high-risk teen girls in Toronto. We are now national, which makes me very happy. And I focus a lot on racialized youth.
Fantastic. Samuel, maybe go to you next.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be joining you guys, so thank you. Yeah, as you said, I'm a blogger. I write at slowtowrite.com. I write about issues facing Canada, around the world, dealing with, I write about critical race theory, abortion, other political issues and cultural issues from a biblical perspective.
Great stuff. Jamil.
Well, I'm really excited about today's event. I work as a lawyer, a policy advisor, and as a writer. And, I have a perspective, I think, on race relations and the position of Black communities in our country, both from a media perspective, also from a policy and governmental perspective. And I look forward to kind of presenting my insights and hearing from our other panelists today.
Okay. And finally, Garth.
Yes, hi, my name is Garth Rowe. I currently teach at Canada Christian College in various courses there, including community outreach and things like contemporary issues in theology. That's basically bringing a biblical perspective on things like euthanasia, abortion, homosexuality, different things of that nature, creation, evolution. In addition to that, I'm a pastor at a church called Solid Rock Christian Assembly, and then finally we pioneered a school here for an elementary school, JK to grade 8, and so I keep busy working as a director here. No pay, but director. I'm kidding.
Good stuff. Thanks so much for that, Garth. Let's maybe just go to some questions then. Maybe we just start with the sort of really broad question. What does Black History Month mean to you? I mean, what do you see as the main value in having this officially designated month? Whether that's as a benefit to Black Canadians and non-Black Canadians. Maybe Jamil, we could start with you on this.
Yeah, well, Black History Month is really special to me for a number of reasons, but I think primarily because we live in a cultural, political, and social environment where the Black identity is constantly being defined in a variety of different ways. And there are a lot of powerful institutions like in the media, academia, and also political parties that really want to control and what it means to be a Black person. In many ways, not because it benefits our communities at all, but because it allows for these institutions to have more influence over us and also over their own political, economic, social objectives. So Black history is an opportunity, I think, to show that a lot of the attempts to simplify who Black people are, a lot of the attempts to control how we exercise our voices, the impact we try to have on society, is actually baseless when you put the bigger picture of our communities, because we're actually very diverse group of people. Our history attests to that. We often have different values, different ideas. We challenge the world in different ways. We dream differently. We pursue a better world with different visions in place. And I think Black history is just a way for us to affirm that at a time where I think there are a lot of powerful forces that want us to see ourselves in a very narrow and controlled way. So that's one of the reasons why Black History Month is so exciting to me. And it reminds us, I think, of also the power we have as individuals in the present to see the kind of adversity that Black men and Black women have overcome, to see the innovation and the beauty that Black people have been part of, that a lot of the simplistic and negative stereotypes that are attached to our identity actually don't define us and never have. So it's a call, I think, in the present for us to fight for that respect and for that recognition. And I think it's as relevant now as it ever has been, given that our identity is perhaps more politicized today than it has been in a very long time.
Great points, and we'll come back to the issue of identity, I think, a little bit later on in the conversation. But maybe Tanya, wanted to go to you. What Black History Month means to you?
Oh, it just means a celebration of who you are. So I have Black History Month all year round with my book club, because I just don't believe in 1 month. So I believe in celebrating everybody and who you are, and it's about learning from each other who you are. It's not learning from the media. And I always tell the young women to celebrate who they are. So Black History Month just gives us a time to celebrate and create our own runways to do that.
Great stuff. Garth, your thoughts. What does Black History Month mean to you?
Yeah, just adding to what was said earlier about Black folks are quite diverse. I can recall it being said in the United States, I think it's the current president who said, unlike the Hispanic community, unlike the Black community, the Hispanic community is a unique, diverse set of people with individual, independent thoughts, and many were taken back by it because oftentimes, as was said earlier, we're placed in this sort of a narrow. The outlook is so narrow, and people try to define who you are. But as far as Black History Month, I think a few things we can achieve from that. First of all, it's a time to reflect on the history of Blacks. See where they're coming from, look at the current status, and then, of course, a future outlook. Next thing, it's pretty much, again, like a milestone or crossroad for assessment, for resolving problems, and then at the same time to come up with progressive planning to better the Black community towards advancement. And there is also the issue of breaking down barriers, including the victim mentality that has saturated the Black community in an incredible way, and of course to chart a course to motivate and mobilize Black folks, especially young people, towards greatness. And finally, it's an opportunity to learn from the overcomers, those who were able to overcome in the past, and the achievers, and to see how we can piggyback on all of that. So it is important as far as the Black History Month.
Great stuff. And finally, Samuel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate Black History Month in its original context, especially as I was growing up. I learned about Black history or Black Canadians, or African history in many ways, being African, being originally born in Ghana. When I moved to Canada, I wouldn't have learned about people who look like me without Black History Month being taught in the school system. So I very much appreciate that. Black History Month, has affirmed that, like all people, Black people are full of history. The history of Black people is full of tragedy and triumph. And, for so long in our history, it was said that Black people were subhuman or that we were lesser than other people. And that history goes to affirm that, like I said, is just full of triumph and tragedy like everybody else. The concern with our thinking on Black History Month today is that it's become less of a celebration and more of a grievances against white people, and it's become more of a critical race history month, and that is moving away from the original context and the original meaning of what it was supposed to be, and that is deeply concerning to me.
Okay, and sort of speaking on that, that issue's come up a couple of times now, so maybe we'll just sort of get right into that. We're obviously in a cultural moment right now where what you might call identity politics or called woke politics, they're placing increasing emphasis on our differences, including things like race, rather than the things that we share in common. And so I'm wondering what people's thoughts are, the panel's thoughts are on that emphasis making Black History Month maybe more politicizing than it used to be in the past. Maybe Garth, what are your thoughts on that?
When it comes to the issue of wokeism, I mean, it's so prominent now. Sometimes people say you go woke and then you get broke. I personally think that where wokeism, I guess in a case like this, it probably focus. I mean, the definition is so hard to sort of put in a just fine tune, but basically it's a focus on issues of racial prejudice, discrimination, injustice, and so forth. But then it gets quite muddied after a while, because then we start to throw everything in, you know, things like the LGBTQ community, political affiliation, and so forth. And after a while, you see where, as a Black community, we need to wake up from wokeism, because it's not, I don't see it as something beneficial. It's used as a setting, as was said by Samuel, to create this grievance and this anger, and to start to fight useless battles that will ultimately not push us forward as a people. But I think we need to get into a very calm, focused environment where we become really constructive and start to appropriately define issues. So, for example, oftentimes, you know, Black folks would be seen as a color group, then you'll throw sexism into it or something like that. It's not the same. And so it becomes very complicated, and then we're out there just battling in every direction, and then the political parties see that and they utilize that so as to create all kinds of anger and just destruction within our community.
Jamil, do you want to pick up on that theme, the impact of wokeness on and how it impacts Black History Month?
Yeah, I think, you know, woke politics often wants to own terms like diversity and inclusion, for example. But I think wokeness has a very particular approach. Let me give you an example from this morning. I was reading the Washington Post, and they were writing in the Washington Post about Clarence Thomas, the only Black man on the US Supreme Court currently. And in the Washington Post news article, it's not an opinion piece, it's a news article, they describe Clarence Thomas as, quote, resembling white conservatives. And it's a very bizarre thing to say about a Black man in such a prominent position, to call into question his attachment to the Black community, to call into question whether the Black identity is appropriate for him, given that he is one of the most influential and public Black men in the entire world. But a Canadian newspaper did the same thing to him a couple of months ago. The Globe and Mail was writing about Clarence Thomas and actually published a racial slur in reference to him, as if it was a casual thing to just say in a newspaper. And so you look at that and you say, well, if wokeness has taken hold in these institutions like the Globe and Mail or like the Washington Post, why is it that they can disrespect a Black man so openly and brazenly? And it's because he is not the right type of Black man for wokeness. Right. He doesn't get included in diversity and inclusion. And so he can be disrespected because his politics aren't what woke institutions want. And to me, that's a deep, deep problem when we talk about wokeness, is that it uses a superficial approach to diversity and inclusion. It wants people who look different, but think and speak the same ways. And that's not true diversity in my mind. So the biggest issue I have with wokeness and why it is so deeply out of touch with the spirit of Black History Month is that it is trying to homogenize our community. And we have never been homogenous. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had very serious disagreements, and important ones, that they debated intelligently, and they respected one another. And that is the spirit of our community, and has always been the spirit of our community. But wokeness seeks to fundamentally shift us away from that.
Fair points. Tanya, any thoughts?
I have nothing to add to that. That was so well said.
Samuel, do you want to weigh in?
That is well said as well. But what I would add to that is, wokeness is managing to do what slavery and segregation couldn't do, which is divide black people in a incredible way, which is a strong statement, but it is true. When you look at the number of people today who are being manipulated to call their cousins, their siblings, their parents, their black neighbors, racial slurs like Uncle Tom or Coon because they're not woke. That is. Now I know these terms have been used for a long time, but they've become much more prominent, and as Jamil suggested, very mainstream, where we've gone to a point in wokeness now that the president of the United States could say that if you don't vote for him, you're not black. And the sad thing is, he received very little blowback from that because a lot of woke people agree with him. All you would have, in our country, Prime Minister Trudeau, when he was exposed for wearing blackface, the his defense that he's not a racist is, well, look how woke I am, because the idea is that so long as you're woke, you're really black, or that you support black people, and it becomes this a stereotype that Black History Month is supposed to be fighting against. And there is no stereotype against with black people, that we are all very different, diverse group. When I heard Garth speaking, I smiled. I love that. I know that he has a Caribbean background. I've lost my African accent, at least most of my African accent, but I'm an African. And while there's so many similarities between black people from Caribbean descent or from African descent, we have a lot of differences as well, and there's beauty in that. And even with Ghanaians, I'm a Fanti, and then some Ghanaians are Ashanti. We have differences there, and even some Fantis are also very different in many ways in how we think or how we do things. So instead of creating these stereotypes, let's just enjoy our diversity, real diversity, not in wokeness, but in as people who are made in the image of God, and it's expressed in us in different character and different personalities.
These are great observations, and there's a real tragic irony in that, wokeness in its quest to sort of present this ideal almost wants to excommunicate individuals from a community because they don't conform to this ideal. I thought I might ask a question from the perspective of someone who's not a Black Canadian. It's often the case that the main reference points that I have for the experiences that Black people face tend to come from the United States. Partly because it's obviously the Black community is much larger as a percentage of the population there, but also because overall the influence of U.S. culture and media on Canada is so great. So I wanted to put to you as Black Canadians, in your view, as far as you can understand, how does the experience of being Black in Canada differ from the experience of Black Americans? Maybe, Samuel, we were last with you last time. Maybe we could start with you this time. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry for that. Yeah, it's a great question. There are many similarities, as you said. We have a lot of the same interest in pop culture and things like that, and that very much dominates a lot of our interest. But the major difference between, I think, Black Canadians and Black Americans is, I think the vast majority of Black Canadians today come from immigrant backgrounds. I think most Black Canadians today are either first generation or second generation Black Canadians, and that leads to a difference in how we understand our nation. And I think also just being a Black Canadian who's originally born in Ghana, it may sound strange, but in the U.S., I think there is an idea that their ethnicity is Black. That's in part because many of them do come from slave ancestors and things like that. But more so for many Black Canadians that I know, including myself, is that I was born in a nation where the majority of people were Black. So being Black was never something that was necessarily unique or special to me. It was being Ghanaian or being Fanti, being from my ethnic tribe. And I think that plays a big role in the difference between Black Canadians and Black Americans.
Okay, Tanya, your thoughts?
I think the major difference is that Americans think they own Blackness. I've heard that from a few people, that if you try to put Canadian authors in America and talk about like books and stuff like that, the sales won't be as high, but like American Black authors are respected here, but Canadian Black authors are not as respected in America. And you really have to push like your books and stuff like that. So I think they feel they own it. And I think that's the major difference.
That's fascinating. Not something that would ever have occurred to me. Gareth, your thoughts?
Well, I think Blackness, well, to start with, the US is a bigger, bolder, and a more expressive culture as it relates to Blackness. Canada, on the other hand, is, well, smaller. By that we mean population, a bit more passive, and possibly it's often said that Canada is a bit more on the polite side. So oftentimes, for example, I was in Florida. I was driving back up, and then I stopped at a plaza, and it was, I think it was a time when Obama was going for his first term, and I mean, it's amazing the way people cornered me and thinking I was an American and telling me how to vote. And then I said, what if I just thought I'd just play the devil's advocate. So I said, what if I wanted to vote for the Republican Party? They said, you wouldn't vote for that because you're Black, you're one of us, and so forth. And I said, well, at least, regardless, I should be given the opportunity to make a choice. It's like we don't even allow voting for the other party here, because as far as they're concerned, Black should be voted that way. And I think 92% of the people voted for the Democratic Party. But regardless, in the US, it's bold, it is strong when it comes to Blacks here. And another thing, there's some advantages to that for the Black community, because, for example, I have relatives there. I have a cousin in Florida there. He owns like 57% of the special transit system there in Broward County. This is what we'd consider wheelchair trans here in Canada. And I have another one who's done amazing as far as the US. In Canada, it's a little different. You may not see as many major execs, people who occupy places of prominence. I was working with Xerox, and then the CEO was transferred from the US, and he became the head of Xerox Canada here. And I remember sitting there, and I heard all these people saying, all these Black folks in the background, wow, I've never seen anyone from our color group occupying these places of prominence. Unlike that in the United States, even though there is a problem, having 40 million there, which is more than the population of Canada, you do see more Blacks in prominent position to create open doors and to create opportunities there. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that there is still a difference. I think in Canada, there is a more acceptance of something, a more docile approach as it relates to the Blacks in general. On the average, in the US, there's a more assertiveness and aggressiveness in that area, if anybody said it makes sense.
Okay. And finally, Jamil, I don't know if any of the other panelists have lived in the US, but Jamil, I know you went to law school in the US, so you've lived on both sides of the fence. So really curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really good insights in everything that's been said so far. So maybe I'll just focus my answer just on a policy perspective. So if you're making policy in the United States and you want to address some of the unique challenges that face Black families, Black communities, is some historical context you have to account for that is different from Canada. So for example, in the United States, there were deliberate efforts like redlining to segregate housing, which still to this day means that there's tremendous residential segregation in the United States. And this is true in southern and in northern states. There's also a difference in the war on drugs. The United States had a very serious drug problem, as people probably know, in the 1970s and 1980s, that resulted in a very harsh and in some cases draconian law enforcement response to poor communities, many of which were majority Black areas of the United States. So, you know, if you're working in government, or if you're an elected official, a lawyer, if you're someone who's trying to solve problems that exist in our cities, in our rural areas, that history makes a very big difference. And as a Black man who grew up in Toronto and then, you know, spent a big chunk of his 20s in the United States, that's very visible. I mean, just walking around there are certain neighborhoods in most American cities where I know I'm going to find a lot of people who look like me and a lot of people who don't. There are certain neighborhoods in American cities where you can see the legacy of the war on drugs, with tremendous addiction problems continuing to face families. And you go to a wealthier area in that same city and it will look completely different. Now that dynamic exists all over Canada as well. I don't mean to present it as though we are living in some kind of utopia on this side of the border, but the historical context is different. And I think that's one of the things that's dangerous when we allow for the American conversation about race to basically dominate how we talk about race in Canada. Because if you actually want to solve problems, right, which, let's be honest, a lot of people who talk about race in our society unfortunately don't want to solve problems. And I would say, the Black Lives Matter organization is a tremendous example of that. They imported American race politics into Canada. They used an American brand, which is Black Lives Matter, to push their political agenda in our country. And it turns out, I don't know, maybe like a year and a half later, that they used millions of dollars that they raised in ways that are completely unaccountable, including buying a mansion. So, like, we have evidence that the import of American race politics in Canada doesn't necessarily benefit our communities at all. And that's partly because the context is different historically and presently, but also because the more we're talking about the United States, we're not talking about the issues in our own communities. And so one thing that I would say is important for us to know is we have a very rigid education system, for example. And we know that and this is something I know that Tanya works on with her book club, that Black students in different school boards across Canada struggle. They don't get the support they need. On average, they're not living up to their potential in the schools. At home, they might be. In the community, they might be. At the church, at the community center, they might be. But when they're in the classroom, they're not getting the support they need to be the best version of themselves. And we're not talking about that problem. I can't even tell you the last time a politician in this country, whether it was municipal, provincial, federal, was expected to have a solution to that issue in Canada. But we've asked almost every politician to comment on something that happened in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed, which frankly has nothing to do with our laws, has nothing to do with fixing problems in our own jurisdictions, is really just a matter of us playing the role of an American debate and American politics, but at the end of the day, obfuscating responsibility to actually resolve the issues in our own cities. So to me, that's an important sort of thing to keep in mind when we think about what's different and what's similar is, do we want to just talk about problems or do we want to solve things? And if you want to solve things, the differences between the two countries matter a lot.
Sure. And see, Tanya, you've got your hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to add a little bit to that. So what Jamil was saying with regards to our educational system, there are so many talented students. They're so smart, they're so bright, and they're not given the same opportunity. So that's why I did start the book club for high-risk teen girls. And my emphasis was on Black girls and racialized communities because I knew that they weren't given the same opportunities. So what I did was I was able to ask people, and it's very hard to get people to donate money to buy books because books are very expensive. And so I am able to get some sponsorship to buy books for teens where owning a book is a luxury. So can you imagine being in Canada and realizing that owning a book is a luxury? And a lot of teens, their parents can't afford it. You know what I mean? You're asking them to choose between paying the hydro bill and buying a book, or buying food and buying a book. So that's where I come in. And what I do is I get these really amazing authors to come in to inspire these young women to say, you can be anything you want to be, not just be a writer, but you can be anything you want to be. It just takes work, right? And it's not going to be easy. So all these students know that. I have a Nobel Peace Prize laureate coming to speak to the girls on Tuesday for Canada's Awareness Day for Human Trafficking. So it's about inspiring them. The school system isn't doing that across Canada. So like across Canada, a lot of these students, they're not getting their needs met. And it's very hard to meet everybody's needs. But educational wise, like people keep on saying to me, dang, the girls are so smart. I'm like, well, of course. Like, what did you think? Of course they're smart, right? They're just not given the opportunity to show you how smart they are, right? And so that's the constant battle that I have to show how smart Black girls are, to show how smart Indian girls are. You know what I mean? But they're always surprised at how smart Black girls are. And that really, really frustrates me to no end.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm loving the answers here because you're talking about issues that I don't think are getting enough attention because they're being crowded out by the sort of things, Jamil, that you pointed to that are sort of imported American problems, and we're not addressing tangible problems, Tanya, like you're talking about that actually are impacting the Black community in Canada. I think it would be remiss because it is, of course, Black History Month history. So I thought maybe we just take a break. We'll get back to the sort of cultural and political themes. But I wanted to ask each of you if you could name one Black Canadian who, in your view, first of all, that you don't think most Canadians have ever heard of or know enough about, and maybe tell a little bit about, you know, who they are, why it's important that people know who they are. Tanya, you going to start?
Yeah, I'm going to start. I had this one planned. So, and of course, it's going to be an author. So I would love everyone to look up Gylie Johnson. She's a Nova Scotian author. She's young, she's talented, exceptionally bright, a great poet, a great spoken word artist. And her books are with Pottersfield Press in Nova Scotia. So if everyone could look her up, go buy her books if you can, or take her books out of the library and invite her to speak at your events. She's amazing. She's exceptional. And she's a great role model for young women and everybody, actually.
Gylie Johnson. Got that.
Yep.
Got that jotted down. Samuel, let's go to you.
Yeah, the first that would come to mind is probably Mary Ann Shadd Kerry. And she is originally American, but she moved to Canada like many Black Americans, of course, during the 19th century. And she stayed in Windsor, and she created, I believe, she created the first Black newspaper in North America called, I think, the Freedom. I'm forgetting the Provincial Freedom. I think no, sorry, the Provincial Freeman, and I think she's also the first Black woman to go into law school as well in the U.S. And also in Windsor, which we know very much about the history of segregation in America, but we know very little about the history of segregation in Canada, especially in Ontario. And at the time in Windsor, a lot of Black students were not allowed to go into so-called white schools. So she created one of the first schools for Black students in Windsor. And I don't know if many Canadians are familiar with her, but reading her story has been very encouraging to me.
Sorry, and the name again was?
Mary Ann Shadd Curry, or Kerry, Cary, Kerry.
Okay. Jamil.
Yeah, so there is a community that I'd like to draw attention to, which is called Buxton, Ontario. It's near Chatham, Kent, so it's in southern Ontario. And it was established by people who came to Canada via the Underground Railroad. Many of them were born into slavery and fought for their freedom in the United States, risked their lives, and wound up coming to Canada. Were able to settle in that part of the province in Ontario and build a community. There are some famous names that came through there in the sort of history of the abolition of slavery, like William Parker, for example, quite a famous abolitionist who actually fought for his freedom in two states, in Maryland and then in Pennsylvania, wound up in Buxton and went to school. And that's one of the amazing things about Buxton is they created a schoolhouse that was able to provide people of all, who had been through some of the most torturous experiences that a human being could go through and give them the chance to learn how to read and write. And a lot of the stories that we know about slavery, about abolition, about freedom fighting come from people who learned how to read and write at that schoolhouse in Buxton. So Buxton, Ontario is a very special place that a lot of Canadians don't know about. but through building a church, building a school, building a community, they were able to demonstrate that if given freedom, if given the chance to just live their lives without the impediment of criminals, slave owners, and evil government policy at the time, if they were just left alone, they were able to build a flourishing community. And so it's one of my favorite stories in Canadian Black history, and I encourage people to look up Buxton, Ontario.
That's great. And last but not least, Garth.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring up a name that is pretty current, but I don't think the person is known enough. I'm thinking of Dr. Leslyn Lewis. Dr. Leslyn Lewis is a politician, conservative politician, who won the riding of Norfolk Haldimand, just outside of Hamilton, just west of there. Now, the thing that's unique about her is that she came here at age 5. She went through the system and she was able to accomplish quite a bit. But not only that, I think her balanced perspective as it relates to being Black and the whole aspect of a sort of progressive pathway. By progressive, we don't mean like liberal necessarily, but a progressive pathway for Black folks. I think there's a lot that we can learn as far as following her path, and she's also in a position at this point in time to probably become the prime minister of this nation. And I think someone like that, I know down south, when the current vice president came on the scene, a lot was said about her as if it was the second coming of something just utterly amazing. It has not worked out that way, but I think in the case of Leslyn, this is a great opportunity to let an individual like this be known and to see the impact that she can have in terms of the future, and as far as the Black folks in general. I think it's tremendous, and also to create that bridge of appropriate reconciliation so everyone can benefit from that, not just the Blacks.
Okay, thanks for that. Oh, sorry, Samuel.
Yeah, just very quickly, since it's really about unknown names, I have to mention my mother. I know no one besides myself or maybe Jamil would know much about my mom's story. But since the story of Black Canadians is really about immigrants, whether it was originally the immigrants from the Underground Railroad from America, or as I said, the vast majority of Black Canadians being immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa, my mom is really my hero. And she was a single mother in Ghana, West Africa, struggling with poverty. She comes to Canada and lives a Canadian dream, where we were originally in a shelter, facing poverty here too. But she worked so hard. She believed in Canada. She believed in a strong work ethic. And a homeless woman who lived in a shelter now owns her own home in Brampton. And I'm proud to be her son. And my mom is. When I think of Black Canadian history, I think of many women like her in this country.
That's outstanding. It's a touching thing to say. I'm sure your mother would be really honored that you say that. At the MLI, we don't shy away from the touchy, controversial questions. So I got to ask something that's pretty blunt. I don't think that a lot of people dispute that Canada has had a lot of racism in its past, and that racism was, in fact, for a long time, official government policy and institutional in this country. Some people make the argument that Canada is still systemically racist, which I think is a bit of a stronger claim than saying that there's still racism in Canada. So I guess I put the question to the panel. Do you think Canada is still systemically racist? And in particular, is it systemically racist towards Black Canadians? Samuel, maybe we'll start with you.
I'm laughing because I got canceled from a Christian university last year for saying that Canada isn't systemically racist at all. The question I ask is, what do they mean by system? If they say system, do you mean a political system? If it's a political system, then you have to find a law or a policy within the system that would show racism against Canadians. Now, racism is not defined by outcome, right? Critical race theory defines it that way, but it's not. Racism is, a partiality or bias against someone, or it's prejudice against someone. So what it really means is that they're saying that our nation is systemically prejudice against black people. Well, then where within the system will you find that? Our prime minister claims that this country is systemically racist. And I always say, wait a minute. Well, if you are the leader of the system and you're saying the system is racist, then you're saying you're racist, all right? But of course, people don't think of it that way at all because of our ignorance through critical race theory. So I would say, no, it's not. Do we have racism here? Of course we do. Are some politicians probably racist? Probably. I've experienced racism myself, and I know that it exists. But the question is, again, if it's systemically racist, then we have to find somewhere within the system to prove that. And I know I've asked many people to find one policy or law within the system, and people cannot find one. If there is systemic racism, it's more so through, not to be too controversial here, I know we'll deal with it, but it's through many of the policies that people are pushing for equity that is actually showing us, what some would call the soft bigotry of low expectations for black people. But maybe that's for the next question that we might be addressing later on.
Sure, lots of controversy to get to. Gareth, your thoughts?
Oh, I was hoping I'd be the last one on this. So that way.
I can skip you if you want. Do you want to pass for now?
Yeah. No, the only reason is because I'm still trying to create my worldview on it. So I figure after listen to all of you guys, especially Jamil, I'd be able to figure out what I want to say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go.
Anyway, I'm
only. Oh, you're gonna go? Okay.
Yeah. I'll go. Yeah, I think in general, when it comes to racism, we have to be reasonable. I think the bottom line is that racism exists everywhere. As a matter of fact, if you're in a setting where there's only one color per se, after a while you start to have colorism, in the sense that if you're all black, you know what happens after a while? You start to say, well, there is some sort of discrimination between the lighter black and the darker blacks and so on. Then after a while, the shorter blacks versus the taller ones. I think on a whole, there is a real issue. And to be honest, it's a sin problem. As long as you have people around, we always have issues as it relates to some form of discrimination. As far as it being a system, it's hard to say. I would not say there's a deliberate structural institutional system of racism. I think there are efforts to right that to a certain extent. However, the structure is of such that that if you go around and you look at the structure of our various companies and so on, like for example, I'll use this as an example. I used to work with the Ontario Municipal Corp at some point. I recall going to a meeting, and then a white friend of mine, we were like, two brothers from different mothers, he would call it. But then I came from the meeting, and they were all high-level individuals, and then he came back and he said to me, wow, that was a pretty high-level meeting you went to. I said, yeah, I'm not even sure why they called me there. So then he said, how many black folks did you see there? And I said, come to think of it, none. And then he said, that shows you where you're going in this company. But the reality is that intended or not, somehow in a more indirect way, you find that opportunities may not always be as readily available, even though people may not have that intention. So as to whether or not it's institutionalized, I don't think so. But at the same time, I think there's a sort of behavioral approach that sometimes makes it happen almost naturally. Again, it's not an excuse in the sense that there's a place of tremendous opportunities, but somewhere along the line, we'll have to get into some conversation as to how something like this can be appropriately addressed.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
It does. Jamil.
So I think a lot of what is called systemic racism is a matter of disproportionality, right? So people will look at statistics and they'll say, well, Black people are overrepresented in prisons in Canada. Therefore, the prison system has a systemic racism issue. Or they'll say Black people are overrepresented in the number of people who are unemployed or living below the poverty line. Well, that's proof of systemic racism. And I would say that if your goal is purely to talk about problems, then perhaps that is a useful term to use. I'm interested in trying to solve things. And so I don't think that it's a term that lends itself to solutions necessarily. And I think, part of how I would prove that is that it's used in very selective ways. So I'll give you an example. The fact that Black men are disproportionately victims of homicide in Canada, I never hear people call that systemic racism. The fact that Black mothers and fathers are more likely to bury their sons, I've never heard that called systemic racism by a politician in this country. I've also never heard someone refer to the fact that when hospitals or other organizations adopted vaccine mandates, that meant Black people were disproportionately going to be unemployed. I never heard anyone call that systemic racism. I never heard the vaccine passports called systemic racism. So the term is used in ways that I think lend itself to certain political narratives that I'm not sure are intended on solving a problem, but I think are more so about trying to shape the way we look at the world in a way that is ultimately a condemnation of the country and some of its foundational values, principles, like capitalism, like freedom. Things that I think are under attack by ideological movements that just want Canada to be a different kind of country, and they use the suffering of Black folks, Indigenous folks, other minority communities to justify why some sort of broad scale change is needed in Canadian economics and politics, et cetera. So that's my concern with the term. But to get to what I think maybe the core, most useful part of the term, because I don't want to be dismissive of some of the problems that it's used to describe. I don't like seeing Black children disproportionately dropping out of high school. I don't like seeing Black males disproportionately being killed or imprisoned. These are real issues, and I don't want to live in a country where that's the case. I hope we can resolve these things. And so I would just say that a lot of the problems that sort of fall under the systemic racism umbrella are often problems of class and poverty and differences in resources and what supports people have. The reason, we can debate, I suppose, why some communities have lesser resources and less support than others. I think there's obviously a whole field of sociology that is intended to explore some of that. But ultimately, what I worry about is that systemic racism takes away from some of the shared experiences that people living below the poverty line, also working in middle-class families in this country, share regardless of their background. I believe that, poor people, working class people, middle class people, people who struggle in this economy, regardless of what they look like or where their parents come from, have a lot in common. And I think systemic racism is often a term used to sort of divide us from recognizing that. Because if a lot of people who are struggling in this economy are able to band together and push for changes, we have a better chance of succeeding if we're working together across different racial and cultural groups than if we are being asked to fight purely on our own, one group at a time. And I don't think that's in anyone's best interest, except for, of course, people who don't want working middle class families to have a bigger share of the pie. So that's some of my concern with the term. But I would just want to affirm, I believe a lot of people who use the term are trying to draw attention to real issues. I'm just not sure the term helps us solve anything.
Yeah, that's really interesting framing, because you're acknowledging that it's being used to describe real problems, but you're saying that by using that term, you're maybe leaving a lot out of the picture that might allow us to actually address the problem better. So that's a really interesting point. Finally, Tanya, your thoughts.
Okay, this is what I'm thinking. How do you expect me to go after that?
You and me both.
I'm just like, Samuel was amazing, Garth was amazing, Jamil was amazing. I'm like, okay, all right, I'll speak. But first I have to say, can I get an amen? Because that was all great. Everybody was so fantastic. So listen, I believe in a lot of what everyone just said. But I also look at it this way. I'm a solution seeker. So when I do that through my book club, so I'm sorry that I keep on talking about it, but that's my expertise being brought to the forefront, is working with young women and young men who want to participate in the book club. So I understand that there's like real problems. So I'm not going to look at, is there systemic racism or just racism or institutionalized racism. So I'm just going to say this, is that I see that there's a problem. I see that there's inequities. I see that there's lack of resources, and that's what I tried to solve. So I try to get the communities to come together, help out these young women, get influential women to speak with them and to raise the bar for them so that they feel that they can accomplish what they need to accomplish in life. Like, so if they want to be doctors, they feel they can do it with proper role models and modeling to help them. So that's where I come in. I provide resources to try to like solve some of the problems that the students are facing.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to talk about an issue that's very current right now. We've obviously got a big protest going on in Ottawa, and there's a lot of talk around the rule of law, and this is something that we're very seized with at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and sort of the impact of policing on protests and the way police treat people who break the law. I think there's obviously been a lot of concern historically and even to the present day that certain minority groups, including Black Canadians, are treated differently by police than other people. And, in light of what's happening in Ottawa right now, there is sort of a call now for police to do more. Historically, we often had the opposite problem where there was concern that the police were acting too harshly. So I wanted to get your thoughts, as people in the Black community on the fact that the rule of law is sort of being flouted, and that now there's a real call for sort of police to maybe be more aggressive than they have historically, and sort of how that squares with your experience in the Black community. So, sorry, Tanya, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll go ahead this time first. So I don't have to be all nervous afterwards.
Set the tone. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just talk about my experience. So and this is recent with the police. So in my neighborhood, I'm actually being stalked by somebody. And so there's a street that I won't walk on because the person feels that I should be their girlfriend. And I think they're mentally ill. I'm just putting it out because of all the things that have happened to me. So what I did was I called my local station, police station, and the police officer that took the initial call, she was quite lovely to me, and so was the call center. But then when the other police officer called me back, they didn't take it seriously. And they're like, what, is he on the road 24/7? So I was like, are you serious? And then they're telling me that I need to speak to the man and tell him that I'm not free. I'm like, he's a foot taller than me. And you're asking me to tell him this when he's been very angered that the fact that I will not return his affection. I'm like, are you out of your mind? So I'm like, listen, you're not going to treat me this way. So I made it known that I matter and that my fears are real. And I put it in writing, and I CC'd almost every single community leader within my community. And I made sure that they realized that I was not joking. And I put it on record so that if anything happened to me, they would be at fault because they asked me to endanger my life, right, by speaking to this man. And so what happened is, because I put it on record and I told them, I matter. I matter. As a woman, I matter. As a Black woman, I matter. And so today, I actually got a phone call with an apology from a lovely detective. And now they're actually actively looking for the man that's harassed me on the street. I don't know who he is, but when he sees me, he feels that he owns me. And so, and I think that's what people need to do when it comes to the police. You need to tell them, listen, I matter. I don't care what you think, right? And I'm going to let you know that I matter. Right. And that my community will need me. And so that's just my experience. And I'm sure a lot of women have gone through the same thing too, and a lot of men. So I just made it known. I matter.
Wow. I'm sorry you've had to go through that experience, and I certainly hope you don't have to go through it again. Jamil, your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Tanya, for sharing that, because I think, number one, you're right, you do matter. And I'm happy that you voiced your concerns and that the police responded. I wish they responded faster, but I am glad you got that call this morning. See, the thing that's important about Tanya's story for everyone to keep in mind is there are different functions of policing. And there are some things that police need to do more and they need to do better. There should be no woman in a city like Toronto who feels like she can't walk down a certain street in fear of harassment. There should also be no school in a city like Toronto where a young man could be shot and killed in his school, which is what happened in Scarborough this week. So I would say that we have some clear challenges that require better policing, a better police presence, a better relationship between the police and the communities that they serve. And, you know, a lot of the discourse around cops right now, and this was true 2 years ago as well, gets built around these protest movements, whether it's the trucker convoy or 2 years ago, it's Black Lives Matter. And I appreciate that that commands a lot of attention, but we have to be very careful that these sort of movements don't dominate how we think about policing to the point where we're making policies that might affect the actual safety of neighborhoods that have nothing to do with the protest. This is what happened with Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, it became politically fashionable to talk about defunding police departments, to talk about taking resources away from cops without thinking through, well, do the most vulnerable communities in that city suffer when the police have no resources? And it turns out that in most cities where there was a defunding of police departments, it wasn't the rich neighborhoods that the police stopped going to. It was the areas where moms and dads are scared they may have to bury their sons. Those are the neighborhoods where the police don't have the resources to go the way they used to. And we've seen increases in homicides all across the United States in the last 2 years because of that. So I think Tanya's story is very important just to keep in mind what are the different ways a neighborhood, a community needs good policing. When it comes to the enforcement of the rule of law in something like the trucker convoy, you know, I would say, I think we also have to probably make the distinction between, you know, making the police having a role to make sure that a neighborhood is safe, regardless of whether there's protesters there or not. And I think it's fair to say there are a lot of people in downtown Ottawa who seem to be concerned about the protests being in their neighborhood. Those are legitimate concerns. You can't dismiss that and say the police have no duty to respond to someone who's saying, hey, look, like, these guys have been parked outside of my apartment building for 3 weeks. It's affecting my life. That person has a voice in a democracy that we have to take seriously. And I think to the extent that fair enforcement of the rules are part of making sure everyone's experiences and perspectives are accounted for, I'm 100% behind that. But what we've seen with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the Emergencies Act is a willingness to go to quite extreme measures. And I do worry about whether the measures he has gone to are going to make the relationship between police officers and some communities worse, because he is putting police officers in a position where we may wind up seeing some very disturbing images of conflict and violence, people being dragged out of certain places, children's aid societies giving warnings to parents that their kids could be taken away from them. This is the kind of stuff we don't want when it comes to law enforcement, because the ripple effects will be disastrous, I think. So it's complicated to figure out what is the right police response to a protest, because we need to make space for protest, but also need to recognize other people have competing rights as well. And I think this is another example why good policing is so important. So I don't want to ramble on about this, but I think there's a lot of really important things there, and I'm not sure I have the solutions, but these are worthwhile concerns.
Okay. Garth, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think when it comes to policing, it's always complicated. They have tremendously difficult jobs. I've been on calls where you have major challenges in terms of psychological cases where people are just on the edge of madness, or outrageous drug cases where people are seeing all kinds of aliens and people coming from the room. And police, they're called into these difficult situations to solve them. It's a very, very difficult job. While at the same time, police officers, again, being ordinary people who need to go home to their family like anyone else. So we start with the understanding that police, they're ordinary people just like all of us, and they want to go home just the same way. Sometimes fear, when that job gets very difficult, they're also fearful, and sometimes they may not be able to make the right decision immediately because just like any of us, if we're just hit with something, sometimes we do not know how to respond appropriately, and regardless of your response, you're going to get reaction from every angle. It's a very tough job. I feel, as far as the protests and so on, that the police, they do have a responsibility to maintain order, safety, both the safety of the truckers and the safety of citizens. But I think the problem we're having right now is a very complicated, or better yet, probably more like a corrupt form of governance to basically politicize the issue as it relates to the police, the policies of such. I mean, and it's hypocritical also, because the same, when we had Black Lives Matter, the Prime Minister, for example, would come, he would take a knee and pledge his allegiance to the movement. And then in a case like this, again, these are still Canadian citizens. He came out with the hardest, possible response, basically calling out the Emergency Act, which is like taking a hammer basically to go after, I don't know, maybe a fly or mosquito or something like that. It's just absolutely unnecessary. And so the police, they're always put into a place where, regardless of their response, is going to create all kinds of backlashes. So I think, in general, if they have good leadership from the head of the police chief and a reasonable government, they'll be able to operate differently. There are some aspects of policing that may not be fair at times, where you may hear Black young people say, like, if three of us are walking up the street, or five Black kids, and if they have hoodies, sometimes they feel that if you go further up and five white kids are walking, the police may slow down a bit, look around. As far as the Black kids and the white folks, they just say, oh, they're just being kids. But sometimes there is a case for that. Sometimes we play the victim too much also. But nonetheless, again, we should sit down at the table, try to come up with a reasonable solution and responses, and make everybody's life easier, including the police officer.
Okay. And Samuel.
Yeah, I'm grateful a lot of the panelists have already addressed the hypocrisy with the politicians in our media concerning them being pro-police when it's mostly white liberals in Ottawa. And again, there's legitimate concern about, of course, things going out of order if the police are not there to maintain peace. Nevertheless, these are mostly peaceful protesters, overwhelmingly peaceful protesters, and yet, our politicians and our media are calling for more police presence to maintain peace. Yet, when many Black people in dangerous neighborhoods are calling for more police presence there so they can protect themselves and their children, our media agrees with Black Lives Matter at the expense of Black Canadians who are fearful for their lives, considering some of the criminal activity in the areas. When I always want to say this, that when we talk about the police, we need to be very careful. So, for example, when I was a kid, when I first came to Canada at 10 years old, I was warned immediately by people who loved me and they wanted what was best for me. But they warned me that I should under no circumstances trust the police because I'm a black person. I'm 10 years old and I'm hearing this. That's gonna have a big impact on me. So one time I actually got lost. At the time I was living in Montreal, the city of Montreal. I'm new to Canada, new to this massive city, and I get lost. I walk around for 2 hours. I see police cars driving by. I don't want to ask them for help because I'm afraid that they might hurt me because I'm a black kid. I walk around. I'm 10 years old. Eventually, I finally, still afraid, I call for the cops to help me take me home. They were so kind and gracious to me. And that shocked me. I was surprised. Well, a few years later, not to go too personal here, but my mom was a victim of domestic violence. Who did we call? The police, right? There are bad cops out there, no doubt about it. But the police overwhelmingly protect black Canadians and all black or all Canadians. We talked about some of the similarities or differences between Black Canadians and Black Americans, and how the dominance of Black American media tends to overshadow some of the problems we have here. Well, one of them is that, at least in the city of Toronto, 70% of people who get killed by cops are Black. That is significantly higher than what it is in the States. Now, some would claim that's racism. And again, I don't know every individual case, and that's possibly true. But the reality is, um, these issues are more complex than what the media would want us to portray. I don't want cops to assume the worst of Black people, and I also don't want anyone, including Black people, to assume the worst of cops. That only makes their jobs harder, and it doesn't help anybody.
Okay, yeah, pretty compelling personal experience there, Samuel. We've got a couple of good audience questions I want to get to, but one last one, and because I wanted to touch on something that Jamil had said earlier, and it relates to another current event, which is something that has actually led to these convoy protests, which is the vaccine mandates and sort of the COVID restrictions generally. It's fair to say they've been controversial. Public opinion has been divided over them. But one story that I think does not get talked about enough is who bears the brunt of a lot of the punishments for these restrictions, who's excluded, who suffers loss of job, loss of income. And Jamil, as I think you pointed out, in some cases, there are communities, including the Black community, that are disproportionately impacted by it. So I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on whether you think that has been talked enough in the media, and what your experience has been in the community. Do you know people who suffered, as a result of these restrictions in a way that maybe other Canadians would not appreciate? I think, Garth, I don't think I've let you go first yet, so if you want to weigh in.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the mandate itself, as far as people being a pastor, I know a lot of individuals who are affected because they've made a personal choice that they do not see the need to be vaccinated. And again, there has never been a time in history where we have to actually walk around and basically state whether or not we're vaccinated. That in itself it's not right, it's illegal at the same time, and medical privacy is pretty much a hallmark of our society. The same thing with bodily autonomy. You make a decision as to what goes in. You're only given one body, and if you choose not to, and the reality again, as the premier mentioned yesterday, the prime minister is triple vax and he got COVID. He also said if you should get the vaccine 10 times, you're still susceptible to it. So I think it's very unreasonable. Now, in the Black community, there are still individuals, again, who listen to the media. Some go into history to recall cases where vaccine or medication or medical procedures took place to their disadvantage. And so many of them are still reluctant. And we see, like in New York, at one point several months ago, there were like 84.6% of the Black community in New York was unvaccinated. And I'm not sure what it is right now. And at the time, the Hispanic community was in the 70s. And so in a case like that, when these mandates come out, it does have a tremendous negative impact on these individuals. But regardless, not even limiting it to individuals from a certain color group or whatever, but I think in general, these mandates and the measures are draconian in the sense that to get to a point where people cannot travel to visit their relatives. Many immigrants are here, sick relatives overseas, and I think it's unreasonable. It's draconian, and if people choose not to, they should not have to get a job in order to keep their job, and so more or less, I'm not for it, these mandates. I think they're basically very unreasonable.
Okay. Tanya, your thoughts?
I'm totally against that. Sorry. Totally against it. I don't want to be around people who are not vaccinated. I believe that we have a social contract in society that we should help each other. I don't want to catch COVID. I have underlying health conditions, And if you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But like, why should I put my life at risk being in a room with somebody who's not vaccinated, or go out to a place where people have who choose to live a risky life and come in contact with you, and you can get COVID, take it home, and kill somebody. I just don't agree with that.
Okay, well, never let it be said we don't have disagreement on our panels at the MLI. Jamil, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor. My immune system was destroyed by chemotherapy. Throughout this entire time, I could very reasonably adopt the same perspective as Tanya. I understand exactly why she feels the way she does, and even though I don't have that view, I disagree with her, but I understand exactly where she's coming from. My view on this has been primarily one of fairness to people. So in summer 2020, every institution in our society, the media, the government, the universities, all told minority communities that they're living in a racist country where the government doesn't like them and is actively trying to hurt them. That was the narrative that everybody promoted for the entire year of 2020. A year later, those same institutions then went to those same minority communities and said, how dare you hesitate to get a vaccine that the government wants you to take? And my view on this has always been, if you want to be fair to people, you have to appreciate that people are going to come from different perspectives. And people may not get the vaccine as quickly as you'd like. Maybe they won't get it at all. That is part of living in a free democracy. And punishing people from those communities that you just told shouldn't trust the government, and now you're telling them, give the government your body, I think that was a very unfair thing to do to people. And I saw, countless employers, governmental offices, private businesses treat people very poorly as it relates to passports, mandates, etc. That has been my concern throughout this whole thing, in my view. And that affects, of course, Black communities disproportionately, Indigenous communities disproportionately, low-income communities of all backgrounds disproportionately. The very people who were relied on to keep our economy going, while a lot of privileged folks stayed at home during lockdowns, were disproportionately the people who were punished through these policies. And you can debate why they were necessary. I totally understand the public health, justifications behind some of this, where people are coming from. But at the end of the day, I think as a society, you have to ask, are you treating people fairly? And I don't think that a lot of communities were treated fairly throughout the imposition of these policies. And my only hope moving forward is that governments might be humble enough to recognize that you've got to build a relationship so that these communities get treated with more respect. I think they deserve that.
Jamil, you're hopeful if you want humility coming from the political level. We really don't see a lot of that very often. And
we can hope.
Yeah, you make a powerful point though, that if everyone's just spent all this time saying don't trust the man, and then suddenly you switch and say, well, how could you possibly not trust the man? Well, maybe it's because you just spent all this time telling us that we shouldn't. So that's a really good point. Samuel, you got anything to weigh in on the vaccine mandates?
Yeah, I just to add to what Jamil said, according to the federal government and in Ontario, the provincial government, they define systemic racism as any policy, even appearing neutral, that leads to racial inequities. Well, according to their own definition of systemic racism, then they would be systemically racist by their own words, concerning how they've implemented the vaccine mandates. So, and yet, hypocritically, of course, they then would label people who are fighting against the vaccine mandates as white supremacists, right? So I am completely against the mandates. I had let's also remember, and this is true. This is evident, as Garth mentioned before. Even a triply vaccinated prime minister still got COVID. The vaccine does not protect people from being able to get COVID, nor even transmitting it as well too. But more than that, I had COVID in November, and yet literally a day after I had COVID, when I'm immune, this is true. When you have COVID, you're immune for a significant time. And yet, because of the vaccine mandates, I had to get my vaccine shot the very next day, which was very dangerous. I was still, while I had recovered, I was still weak. But yet I got it because I had to get it that very day so I could get married. Otherwise, I wouldn't get married. It's a bit of a long story, but I wouldn't get married for another 2 years. And many Black Canadians were forced into that position. I have friends, many of whom now are being marginalized in their society, who just 2 years ago they were being told that that they were being oppressed just for being Black in this country, and yet now they are being oppressed. They can't go to restaurants, they can't go to movie theaters, they can't leave the country to go visit their family because they're making a choice that they believe is best for them. Some choices that their doctors believe is best for them, and yet the government disagrees, and therefore they no longer have the rights that they believe they had.
Okay, thanks. Well, some strong views on the vaccine mandates. I just actually got an email question, which I wasn't expecting, but someone who was not able to ask a question on YouTube. And they had a very specific question, but I think there's a broader theme here about how we go about recognizing historical figures. And they were asking where the panel stood on the renaming of Dundas Street in Toronto, which was, of course, named after a Scottish fellow who was associated with the slave trade. So maybe who wants to start on this one? Tanya, you have any thoughts?
Tanya sounds like she wants to.
Oh, yeah.
Do we need to rename streets? Yeah.
Are you picking on me because I'm a woman? Come on now.
Ladies first.
Oh, no.
Ladies first.
I'm like the only woman here. Oh, geez, this was hard. I was of two minds when it came to this, right? One, it costs so much money. Couldn't that money have put to better use, right? So like you could look at like Dundas Street and say, you know what? Okay, historically, this guy was a jerk. Look at the horrible. I was going to use another word, but I think we're live, so we can't like use that word. So like historically, look what he did, right? And then you can talk about, so what can we learn, right? Why was the street named after him in the first place? And what can we do like in history class, like to learn about things that's going on? Where like, are you going to rename everything like from now on? Like, I don't agree with that person. Okay. And maybe they did a couple of things good in society and they did this one horrible thing now. So we have to rename this. So that's setting a precedent to rename every single building or street if they don't agree with what the person did. That's a lot of money, but we can put that money to educate people in different ways and have a discussion. Like I was sensed, like the book club had 2 books that were that the TDSB didn't want students to participate in because they didn't like it. I was like, okay, we just need to have a conversation. We don't need to censor things. We need to have a conversation, and we need to employ critical thinking, right? So, and I think this is where that comes in, is that we need to have critical thinking here. That was a lot of money put to waste, right? And we could have educated a lot of people about that issue. So that's where I am.
Okay.
A lot of waste. There's a lot of waste. We could have used the money for better things.
Samuel, your thoughts?
Yeah. The concerning thing about cancel culture in this way is no one is immune. I can get canceled. We can all get canceled. If you're going to strip someone to one thing they did that is wrong, then no one can stand. What about our prime minister with blackface, right? We are, look, I'm a Christian, and the Bible says that there's no one good, not even one. And I don't want to live in a world where people get canceled for some of their sins or some of their failures, because then I can get canceled. And look, as I said before, I'm a pro-life advocate. A lot of the people today in our culture, many of our heroes are people who are pro-abortion. Many years from now, when hopefully, we end abortion, should we cancel every single person who was for it? I say no. I don't want to live in that kind of culture where, again, people are stripped to just one thing that many of us are against. So I'm very concerned about that. And increasingly, it's getting more and more accepted in our society. And so I'm completely against it. What Tanya said is very true as well too. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of time. Now, I'm not against people privately. If it's a school, private school, they want to make their own changes. That's okay. I might disagree with it, but that's fine. But when you're using public resources and our time to change names and change street names and buildings and everything else, it's okay to you can still keep the name and address the totality of this person's character. You can address, because here's the thing too, you don't want to completely erase history in this way. I think it's good to say, you know what? Yes, Dundas is named after a person who owned slaves, but you know what? That's teaching us something about our history, including even something about Black history, right? So erasing this does not do any of us good.
Okay. And Garth, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think right now we've gotten to a place now where if anyone says anything and no, you kind of wonder who's God now, who's the one to determine what's right from what's wrong. The issue we're having is that many people are sitting in Silicon Valley in their little hoodies, sitting there, these 24-year-old kids or 22-year-old trying to determine what's right from what's not right. We don't want to hear this, put this aside and so on. And then you say, wow, here we go through big tech and big government, especially when they become this awful combo. They've created this chaotic society. And right now we're creating a sort of vindictive, vengeance-like society. And it's just not a good spirit for any people to live together, especially a multicultural community. And so if we're going to have issues with renaming Dundas Street, then I guess we may have a problem, as was said, with the Prime Minister, who himself, again, he's a feminist, but he's a groper at the same time. He's for Native Indians, that he carried out major firings there. Oh, he's for integrity. Then there is the WE scandal and different things like that. And of course, the blackface, brownface. I mean, it goes on in terms of his endless sin. Yet at the same time, he leads the woke pack, and he's destroying society. Taking that path. And if we're going to do that, then George Washington, I think he owned slaves. John A. Macdonald, he'll be in trouble too. The bottom line is that we would just go on, and we will never be able to come to any kind of solution. History is history, whether we like it or not. And we have to respect that, learn from it. We when it comes to history, you basically learn from the good and eradicate the bad in terms of your own personal development. But you need everything to be able to make you holistic, to be able to understand, get the big picture. And I don't see any benefit in that. It's a waste of resources. And if there's a portion that's from me trying to protect the Black community, maybe what you could do is just save a bit of the statue and then send me my portion. And then I'll investigate something more progressive.
Yeah, fair enough. Jamil, last but not least.
Well, I think I may be last and least in this situation, because I don't have much to add. I think Tanya, Garth, and Samuel touched on a lot of the important considerations here. So I will ask everyone to reflect on their comments. I don't think I need to add anything.
Okay. We've got a question from the audience here. Vivian asks, the panel, what would your advice to politicians be to deal with the, quote, identity politics that we are seeing and hearing today? Maybe Jamil, since you were short and sweet, we'll start with you on that one.
Sure, yeah. I'll put maybe 3 suggestions out. First one is be focused on solutions. It should be a given that politicians would focus on solutions, but unfortunately, that's not how the game works in all situations. And I think that is a key part of this. If you want to move away from divisive identity politics, well, if you focus on solving problems, you can't use divisive identity politics to get us anywhere. So I think that's one way of solving it, is just be clear about what you're actually trying to achieve. The second thing I would say is we need to really build on, restore, celebrate a Canadian identity that we share. I really believe that what's happening with the trucker convoy, whether you agree with their political position or you don't, what's clear is the world pays attention to Canada when we have serious conversations. We are a significant country. people respect us. And I think we should embrace that identity and build an identity we all share. And I think that's something we really, especially when it comes to educating children, I think that's something that we can prioritize and make sure that kids know what it means to be a Canadian. Why do they call themselves a Canadian? How can this country bring together people from all these different backgrounds and cultures and all these different corners of the world and fashion an identity that we all feel a part of? So I think that's another key part of it. And the third thing I would say is, and this is something that I know a lot of people will probably disagree with me on, but I think one of the solutions to identity politics is talking more about class. We have a very stratified society that COVID has only made worse. Big tech, as Garth mentioned earlier, big multinational corporations got exponentially richer while small businesses were shut down, while most of us were locked in our houses, while mental health and addiction issues in our families got worse. The wealthiest people in our society did very well, especially wealthy people in the United States who make a lot of money in Canada. So I think, in my view, one of the reasons why woke corporations have embraced identity politics in the way they have is it keeps our eyes and our ears away from the real inequalities that have gotten worse, which affect everybody of all backgrounds. So those would be three suggestions I'd put out there for how we might overcome some of the divisive identity politics and get toward making things better.
Okay. Samuel, any thoughts?
Yeah, in light of Black History Month, I will paraphrase two of some of my heroes or Black American heroes. And that would be Frederick Douglass, who, being an abolitionist, said that his goal is not to seek freedom for Black people, or he said to not seek justice for Black people, but to seek justice for humanity, right? Because he said what was best for the Black, well, as Martin Luther King himself also said himself later on, he said that what is best for Black Americans, so is best for white Americans. What's best for a citizen in a country is good is best for every citizen. I don't want politicians to want my interests as an individual based on my skin color or anything. I want them to do what is right by all Canadians, because justice, human rights is not based on a certain group. It's just based on all humanity, right? I want people to seek to want my freedom. I want white people to have the same rights that I have, and in this nation we do. So the way to get rid of identity politics is simply to focus on our identity as a humanity, or all of us being made in the image of God, and not focusing on our skin color or other things that would divide us.
Okay. Tanya, your thoughts?
I think that we should all just celebrate each other instead of like feel divided. I think that we should all celebrate each other's cultures, each other's backgrounds, ethnicities, religions. And if we focus on celebrating and everyone joins the party, then we're good. It's when we're divided and you exclude people, that's when there's a lot of problems. So I've always been about celebration, celebrating people, celebrating who they are, where they come from, what they do. I love listening to stories and people's tragedy, triumphs, their family history. It's all important, and we all need to sit down and, at the end of the day, listen to each other. Like, really listen without listening to speak, and try to listen just to understand. And I think that's where we need to be.
That's a really positive message that I think we could really use right now. Last but not least, Garth.
Well, I think first of all, we need to be independent thinkers. Basically, listen to less of the mainstream media and these outlets that would try to present a narrative so as to move you and shape you in whatever image they would like. Number two, I think politically we should have really no allegiance to any particular party. You know why? Because oftentimes if people think you're your allegiance is to them, they can move you in whatever direction. And so these kind of they will not be able to manipulate you politically. So basically, you stick to what you feel is most right. Move with that and be flexible and versatile enough so you can make changes where necessary, as opposed to say, well, my mother and my father, this is the way they think politically, and I must keep it that way. And then a final thing is just to love your neighbor. I think if we go there, the Bible said love covers a multitude of sin. If we go out there and start to really love one another, what happens is that we create such an incredible bond that is very difficult for people to tell you all kinds of awful things about your neighbor. And so you start to be like Martin Luther King Jr. now, where you start to focus on the content of one's character as opposed to the color of one's skin. A person can be black, a person can work towards solving the issues in the black community while at the same time be holistic in terms of your love and your affection for your fellow man, in the sense that we can hug, embrace, and be able to build commonality and push forward as a people. And if we do that, I think we'll be able to break this identity politics that tend to divide and bring us into all kinds of narrow stream of vengeance and vindictiveness.
Okay, well, that's good advice. Well, we're just about out of time. I know I promised everyone a few moments to just make some final statements. So if each of you have a couple sort of parting messages you want to give people in recognition of Black History Month, Tanya, maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, thank goodness I'm not after Jamil. Like, I just feel so inadequate. Just put that out there. I just feel that for Black History Month, just love one another and go out and celebrate people. Go out and celebrate Black people. You know what I mean? Just like go out and celebrate them. And we love Black people, love everybody too. Like, you know what I mean? Like, tell me which Black person won't want to go to a party that I know. Like, I know some, you invite a Black person to a party, they're like, yeah, I'm there. So we all know that. So let's just all celebrate each other. Like, it's a perfect month to do that. And we need to keep warm because February is the coldest month. So that's my little thing going on there.
Well, sound advice. Thank you, Tanya. Garth, your thoughts?
Yeah, when I came to Canada as a kid, I came here at age 10 or 11, and then I spent a few years here. Then I went back to Jamaica for holidays. I went for 3 weeks and ended up spending 6 years, just a mild extension of my holidays. But after coming back here, I was able to get, I was able to grow up there a bit. And it was not unusual to see a Black prime minister, a Black teacher, lawyer, doctor, whatever. It was just so common. But when you came to Canada, all of a sudden you realize that there was just such a strong emphasis on color. And what I realized, if I could just give one quick story, I remember a young lady who attended boarding school with me in Jamaica. We came to Canada and I saw her one day, and my goodness, I saw her on the bus, Eglinton West, and I saw her, I said, hi, how are you? And then, my goodness, she was such a loving young lady, but now she was bitter. She looked like a bulldog baptized in lemon juice. And so I said to her, what's wrong with you? She said, have you read the book Roots? And at the time, and I'm like, have you seen what they've done to us? And I said to her, the truth of the matter is that if reading it and so on is going to cause my face to look like yours, I do not want to participate in that. The reality is that when we came here, you realize that the environment is a bit different. Kids here oftentimes do not. We have a pastor on the staff here who's a professor at one of the university here. And she said when she was teaching, a Black kid came up crying to her and said, I've never seen like a Black professor before, and I'm so in my class, and I'm so honored, crying. The reality is that I didn't realize the significance of it because coming here didn't mean anything to me at the time. But more or less, I'm realizing that if we're going to make a difference in this society, we're going to have to, first of all, be driven. Do not use the victim mentality. Love one another and be. And as you cross borders and love and push forward, many barriers will come down, and we need, and you will achieve. Canada has tremendous opportunities, and I think the Black community can do great things here. And that's it.
Okay. Samuel.
Yeah. As I mentioned, the story of Black Canadians is very much largely the story of immigration whether it was, second class, sorry, not second generation Black Canadians, or immigrants, or just the many Black Canadians whose ancestors have been here since the 18th or 19th century. So I, and that's really the story of Canada, right? Even if you're not Black, the vast majority of Canadians are descendants. Their grandparents or their parents moved to Canada, and I say all that because, in light of identity politics, I don't want us to single out Black people as a different group than other Canadians. Are we different in many ways? Of course we are, but our story really is the same. That we came to this country either on our own or our ancestors or our parents to seek freedom and to seek peace. And that is what I really want. It concerns me when so many of Black history, as I said before, is not a celebration. It is not joy. It is not about peace. It's instead about grievances against white people, and it concerns me. Ibrahim Kendi, in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I call How to Be a Racist, he says that the remedy for past discrimination is future discrimination against white people. That is the norm. That is what's being said in our culture today, in Canada and America, through critical race theory or anti-racist activism. And I want us to really fight against that. I don't want people to be discriminated against for their skin color. I don't like that for Black people. I don't want that for anybody else as well.
Okay. And last but not least, Jamil.
Yeah, maybe what I'll do is just conclude with a reference to sort of the title of today's event. Understanding where we've come from is critical to understand where we're going. Understanding history gives you a sense of how you can imagine the future. If your view of history is very narrow and simple, perhaps overwhelmingly negative, it's difficult to have the kind of optimism required to think that the world can get better. It's difficult to have the kind of optimism required to believe that negative, in my view, oppressive ideologies like critical race theory, for example, don't have a place in a democracy that wants to be healthy and functioning. So I do believe that, this exploration of Black history, this conversation we've all been having together, the kind of conversations that Tanya has with students in her book club, the kind of writing that Samuel does on his blog, slowtowrite.com, the kind of teaching and preaching that Garth does at Canada Christian College and other places. All of this is about helping people understand the breadth of experiences, perspectives, insights that our community has and has always had. That's the key takeaway here. We've never been simplistic. We've never been narrow. We've never been easy to control and define. And I really hope that that's the biggest takeaway of all that we come out of this conversation with, because we've got to look very critically at the ideological movements, the political parties, the media corporations, the universities that are constantly trying to tell you otherwise. Why is that? Why are they so at odds with Black history? Why is Black history an indictment of these political projects that try to tell you Black people only think, feel, speak, and experience things in certain ways? It's because there's a power in the Black identity to manipulate it, but there's also power in understanding Black history to overcome that manipulation.
Wow, powerful stuff, Jamil, and to all of you, just a great conversation. I do quite a few of these panels and interviews, and I've got to say this has been one of the most interesting and informative ones I think I've done in a long time. So I want to thank you, all of you, again for joining us, and to the audience for tuning in. We will also be posting a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel in short order. So if anyone wants to share it with friends or acquaintances, please feel free. And anyone curious about the work we do at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, please check out our website at macdonald-laurier.ca. Thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you in the next webinar.
Okay, thank you so much.